Mary Robinson, thank you so much for joining me to mark International Women's Day. And of course, you made history when you became the first woman president of Ireland in 1990. You also co-founded the Council of Women World Leaders. As we mark International Women's Day 2024, what do you see as the greatest challenges to gender equality?
Well, you know, Tanya, there are real challenges, unfortunately. We should be making progress every year and every decade. We had the Beijing famous conference quite a while ago now, and we thought that the graph would be going up on gender equality. But unfortunately, because of populist and right-wing movements in particular, it's going backwards in some countries, certainly in the United States and even in Europe. And you know, these European elections coming up will not necessarily be very good for advancing further gender equality, which is so vital to our world.
Women's leadership, you've said yourself, would have a greater impact within the world. Do you think there'll be more women leaders like yourself?
Well, Tanya, we have a world dominated by male leadership. You know, we have so many male presidents and prime ministers, and look at how fractured and anxious and divided our world is. If we had more balance, if we had more women in top leadership, and leadership in also being parity, gender parity, meaning 50% in governments, in cabinets, in parliaments, it would make a huge difference. Because women have a different perspective. I don't mean that women are better than men. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is women tend to be more practical about what will make a difference in people's lives, more experienced because we have tended to be living in the real world and not isolated in a leadership that too often is affected by lobbyists or affected by, you know, partisan issues. And not actually dealing with the real problems.
What concerns you most, Mary, as you say, in our fractured world?
What concerns me, because I also, you know, am now chair of the elders that Nelson Mandela brought together in 2007 to work on peace and human rights and a sustainable world. We have identified three existential threats that we're focused on: the climate and nature crisis, the pandemic crisis, because although we've had COVID, we haven't learned lessons properly for the next crisis, and nuclear weapons. And we're increasing the weaponry and the sophistication of those weapons, and maybe AI will be even more dangerous. So we're in a time when we actually need collaboration beyond belief in resolving these issues. And what the elders have been putting forward is the need for long view leadership. Leadership that looks at the complexity of these problems and understands no one country or no one region can solve these problems. They have to be done collaboratively as never before.
Are global leaders listening to this, though, Mary?
Well, it's not a great time. We are seeing, you know, the short-term populism. And, you know, I actually think social media has at least some role to play in the short-term ism that is affecting everything. You know, social media sort of feeds the brain and feeds young people with these images, which are like sugar to the brain, instead of thoughtful, really understanding complexity and understanding, for example, you know, the climate and nature crisis is affecting the potential future of our whole world. We actually need to work together, not work competitively, for example, on clean energy. You know, not try to sort of divide and blame China if it has too many electric cars. On the contrary, we should be forging better relationships with every country in order to encourage all countries to be able to resolve this problem. That should be the long-term vision we have.
Do you hold social media companies responsible for this negative impact?
Well, I think it does contribute to a negativity, to hate speech, to, you know, angry speech, to, you know, it's not helpful to trying to resolve. Of course, there are advantages of social media, but I think we've learned that it is not the wonderful invention that we thought at the beginning of the internet, that it has a lot of real problems that need to be dealt with better regulation and better controls.
What about the plight of women and girls in conflicts around the world? What more needs to be done to protect them?
Yeah, that's a real problem issue that I've had direct experience of when I had my mandate as the special representative, special envoy of the Secretary General for the Great Lakes in Africa, when there was a real problem in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's a real problem now in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's really sad to see it all being revisited. And look at Gaza. 70% of the deaths in Gaza are women and children. It's really tragic. And unfortunately, again, it's because women's voices are not at the table at a decision-making level enough in peacemaking. We had good experience in Northern Ireland, where eventually a women's party broke through and was part of the discussion of the Good Friday Agreement and brought a lot of really thoughtful measures, human rights considerations into the debate because they were at the table.
You talked of Gaza there. Would the elders call for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas?
Yes, at a very early stage of this conflict, after the horrendous attacks by Hamas and the taking of hostages, which we have totally condemned, we realized that the response really from the beginning of Israel was disproportionate. The bombing was excessive. And so we called at a very early stage for a ceasefire in order to think through, what is this war going to end up with? What's the plan? And we really haven't seen a plan with an outcome that would be what we believe is the only possible outcome, which is the two-state solution and a viable Palestinian state.
How do you feel world leaders have handled the crisis so far in the region?
Well, the interesting thing is I was with a number of elders at the Munich Security Conference, and we saw the real movement in the region itself, which hopefully can be built on. And I know President Biden is trying to form a coalition, and there's been a lot of effort now to bring about some kind of ceasefire. I believe it needs to be a very significant ceasefire in order to allow the humanitarian aid and to think more deeply, more long-term about what this war has inflicted on Gaza and how we get security for Israel, which is very important for Israel as a state and for Israel citizens, absolutely, but also deals with the impacts of the occupation. Ban Ki-moon, who's now my deputy in the elders, he was my boss for 3 mandates, he and I went to Tel Aviv, East Jerusalem, and Ramallah in June. And we issued a report and we said the current situation is unsustainable because we saw a very right-wing government having Israelis tell us, unfortunately, our government is committing the crime of apartheid. I can't tell you how many Israelis, human rights organizations, former ambassadors, former military told Ban Ki-moon and myself in June that they were very sorry, but their government was committing apartheid. So something, was boiling up. And now that doesn't excuse in any way the terrible attacks of the 7th of October, but they didn't come out of blue sky either.
From what you've seen, do you think peace can ever be achieved in that region?
I think I'm actually more hopeful that if we can just listen to the leadership in the region, hopefully release the one man who's held in prison, Mariam Barghouti, who could give a kind of Mandela-like leadership to the Palestinians, I think that would help enormously. And it would be a unifying factor because he's admired in both Gaza and in the West Bank. And, we've learned with the IRA, you have to make peace with those who have used guns and who have, committed atrocities. That's the way you make peace with your enemies. And I think Israelis have to really now understand that the region wants to live in peace with Israel and that Israel has the better chance than ever And the United States is vital in this. The European Union is vital. I wish the European Union was more unified. And I really admire the way my country and Spain and Belgium and other countries are trying to push the European Union to be more understanding of the realities of this conflict.
You talked about Northern Ireland there, and of course we're seeing two women, Michelle O'Neill and Emma Little-Pengelly, appointed as First Minister and Deputy First Minister. What impact do you hope that will have? What significance?
Never underestimate women when they take on leadership of that kind. And the very good thing is that they are working closely together. Just yesterday, they were at a football match, which wouldn't have happened in the past with men. And Michelle stood for the God Save the King. That wouldn't have happened before. Women know, use symbols. I understood that with the light in the window. I understand it now with women's leadership on climate, with Project Dandelion, the importance of symbols. These women have spoken well together, are already forging a very good bond with each other. And I'm hopeful that they will give the kind of leadership that will hold the executive together for long enough to really give the people of Northern Ireland the relief from very real, poverty at the moment in Northern Ireland. It is suffering more than other parts of the United Kingdom, and it's important that that is addressed.
You talked about Project Dandelion, which is described as the first global women-led campaign for climate justice. What do you hope it will achieve?
We want to show a really positive narrative about the climate and nature crisis. Yes, it's a crisis, but we want to gather in all of those who are moving to address at all levels, the indigenous peoples, young people, civil society, scientists, artists, business. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of breakthroughs on solar and wind being much cheaper, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not seeing this in a holistic way. So we need a symbol. And the dandelion is perfect because it's nature. It transforms the soil with deep roots. You can eat every part of it, and you spread it by blowing. And we want, just like, when I was president, I used a symbol of the light in the window for all of those who'd had to emigrate from Ireland over the centuries and over the decades. And that light took on a power of its own. It kind of framed an Irish diaspora, which up to then hadn't really existed, an Irish wider family. And that light, played its magic. I want Dandelion to play the magic because we are on the cusp of a clean energy, healthier, safer world. But we're held back by two things: the fossil fuel lobby and far too much money going to what is harming us, harmful subsidies. So, we learned at COP28 that we have to transition out of fossil fuel, but it has to be a just transition. We have to think of the workers in coal and oil and gas, and in my country, peat, turf. And they have to have a sense of their future with reskilling, with investment in those communities. But also we have to have a just transition in to clean energy, which is accessible, affordable to people. And I'm very aware of the fact that, for example, 600 million people in Africa never switch the switch for electricity. They don't have that clean energy. 900 million still cook on dirty cooking. We have to change that for all developing countries very rapidly, and we need resources to do it. So we need to take the money from what's harming us and swing it to what will make the difference.
But how concerned are you about a potential change in the US administration later on this year? Of course, we have the elections and a possible Trump government because, of course, he took America out of the Paris Agreement.
I think there is that shadow there. It was a shadow there during the Munich security summit that I've just been at with a number of elders. But that's really why we are advocating this long view leadership, because that is totally not what Mr. Trump is about, and other populist leaders. They go for they're like the social media people with large social media followers who may be very empty in what they say, but they have very large followings. And it's the large followings that somehow have taken on importance, social media followers, populist leaders play on that and play on populist short-term things that don't address the complexity of our lives, and the need for greater collaboration, and in fact, frankly, the need for greater compassion. There's far too much anger and vindicate, when I get in, I will do this, that, and the other, which is very negative and very aggressive. And I hope that young people in particular will see the need for the hopeful narrative about their future and will reject that populism.
Talking about female leadership, Nikki Haley, do you think she has a chance? How do you rate her?
Well, I admire her courage in staying in and showing that President Trump, even in the Republican Party, does not have a monopoly. He has his cult following in the MAGA crowd, and they will stay with him. But that's not enough to win an election. And she's showing that, I think. So, I'm glad that she has had the courage to say she's going to stay in, at least for the moment, to make that more visible.
Just finally, according to the World Economic Forum, there was a report in 2023 that at the current rate of progress, closing the overall gender gap will take 131 years. Economic parity will take 169 years, and political parity, which we were just talking about, 162 years. How disheartening is that for the next generation? And what is your message, Mary, for this International Women's Day?
That is an absurd position, isn't it? And that's why when we look around, we see a world that isn't actually addressing problems very well. So the solution is to really focus on gender equality, gender parity in all parts of our community, including in the business world. And, we are seeing far more women leaders, particularly young women leaders. I mean, even in the climate movement, look at the way young women have stood up. It's clear that there is a sense of urgency about ensuring that women play their full role. And I think nowhere more than in the climate space, which is why I'm so proud that, women are connecting through their networks as never before. And the connection is, it's listening, it's open, it's problem solving, it's generous, it's compassionate. And I have great faith that this itself is what is needed in our world, and I hope we will see more of it. I don't believe those statistics. They're kind of sterile statistics of things can move very fast when there's a recognition of the need for long view leadership, more compassion, more dealing with problems with a view to solving them, not aggravating them with anger and populism.
Former President of Ireland, Chair of the Elders, Mary Robinson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Tanya.